What if the strongest fortresses in medieval Europe were never really beaten by their walls, their gates, or their towers because the battle was already decided before an army even arrived? For centuries, castles have been imagined as brute force machines. Thick stone, tall towers, pure strength against pure strength. That image feels logical, and yet it is incomplete. The real story of castle survival was not written in stone, it was written in geography, in the slope of a hillside, the bend of a river. Long before the first wall was raised, medieval builders were already making the most important decision of the entire fortress, not what to build, but where to build it. A hill. A river. Two ordinary features of the landscape, transformed into the most reliable weapons a castle would ever have. The hill came first, not because height looked impressive, but because height changed the physics of an attack. An army climbing a slope moved slower, tired faster, and lost the freedom to approach from every direction. Ladders became harder to carry upward. Siege towers, some weighing several tons, became nearly impossible to roll up an incline. Formation itself began to break apart on uneven, rising ground, turning a disciplined army into scattered, exhausted groups long before the first arrow was loosed. The castle did not have to create every defense on its own. The land was already doing part of the job before a single stone was placed. Where no natural hill existed, builders simply made one, piling earth into a raised mound called a moat, proving just how non-negotiable this advantage was considered to be. Not a wall in itself, but the first wall, and elevation offered something beyond resistance. It offered time. From high ground, a garrison could see dust rising on distant roads, movement near a crossing, torches flickering long before dawn. Messengers, merchants, and armies alike became visible minutes or even hours before they arrived. A castle on a hill was not only harder to reach, it was watching long before it needed to fight. Before the enemy arrived at the gate had already seen him coming. Then came the river. Not simply for water, but as a second obstacle layered onto the first. A river forced an approaching army into a sequence of decisions. March toward the crossing. Search for a place to ford, since not every stretch of a river could be safely crossed by hundreds of men, horses, and heavy equipment. Cross while exposed, in the open, under the sight lines of defenders above, where a single line of archers could turn a crossing into a slaughter. Only then begin the climb. Every one of those steps created delay, and every delay created opportunity for defenders to prepare, to strike, to simply wait while the enemy tired itself against the land. Some builders pushed this advantage further, placing a castle directly inside the bend of a river, where the water itself formed nearly 3/4 of a natural moat. No excavation, no labor. The landscape had already built it for free. And unlike a dug moat, it never needed to be refilled or maintained. But it would be a mistake to think the river solved everything. This is where the story becomes more complicated than it first appears. A river could be blocked. A river could be poisoned. A river could be sat beside for weeks by a patient, waiting army with nothing to do but starve out the people inside. So castles rarely trusted water to a single source. Wells were dug deep into bedrock, sometimes reaching far below the level of the surrounding hill. Cisterns collected rain across courtyards and rooftops. Underground springs were mapped and protected long before construction ever began. The river helped, but it was never the whole plan. Not a guarantee, but one piece of a much larger survival system. The real question a castle had to answer was not simply where is the water. It was how do you keep hundreds of people alive, for weeks or months, if the siege refuses to end. This is where theory becomes history, where a decision made by a builder centuries earlier finally faced its real test. At Dover Castle, positioned on the cliffs above the English coast, defenders faced two separate sieges in 1216 and 1217, including the first recorded use of a trebuchet on English soil, a weapon capable of hurling stones weighing over 100 kilograms. Both times the garrison held. The terrain had done exactly what it was designed to do, absorbing the force of an entirely new class of weapon before it ever reached the walls. At Kenilworth Castle, the story unfolded differently. Surrounded by water defenses that made direct assault nearly impossible, attackers turned instead to patience. The siege dragged on for almost 6 months, one of the longest in English medieval history, until the defenders' food supplies were finally exhausted, not their walls. And at Rochester Castle, in 1215, King John's forces tunneled beneath the keep itself, packing the mine with rendered pig fat to fuel a fire hot enough to collapse one of its towers from below. Even after that collapse, the defenders kept fighting from inside the ruined keep. The siege lasted well over a month before the fortress finally fell. Further east, Crac des Chevaliers, a crusader stronghold built into the hills of the Levant, relied on a concentric design. Walls within walls, each ring positioned to use the slope beneath it. For generations, it stood as one of the most difficult fortresses in the medieval world to conquer, precisely because attackers had to win the same battle against the terrain, again and again, before they could even reach the final wall. Even the river supply advantage had a counter. Attacking forces sometimes drove iron-studded logs across a river's width, capable of tearing through the hull of any supply boat attempting to reach a besieged castle, turning a defensive lifeline into a trap, and reminding defenders that no advantage in medieval warfare went unanswered for long. These were not abstract ideas. They were tested again and again against real armies, real hunger, and real time. Geography did not guarantee survival, but it changed the odds, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, sometimes for generations. And a castle's location was never only about defense. A river was also a road. Long before wagons and pavement could move heavy loads efficiently, boats carried stone, grain, weapons, and trade goods faster and cheaper than any land route could manage. A castle connected to a river was connected to markets, ports, and the wider economy of a kingdom, able to move an entire winter's worth of grain in the time it took a wagon train to cross a single valley. Control the crossing, and you controlled who passed. Merchants paid tolls before their goods reached the other bank. Armies were forced through predictable, watchable routes, unable to move freely across the land. Influence spread outward from the walls, into the valley, into the roads, into the daily lives of everyone who needed to travel, trade, or simply cross from one side of the river to the other. Not just a fortress, but a checkpoint over an entire region. Put the hill and the river together, and a castle became something larger than a home for a lord. It became the eyes, the gate, and the treasury of the territory around it, able to see danger approaching, control who was allowed to pass, and quietly collect the wealth of everyone who needed the river to move their goods to market. Yet there was a cost to this advantage, and it could not be ignored. The most defensible position was rarely the most livable one. Water had to be hauled up steep slopes day after day by hand or by animal. Food and fuel had to be carried the same way, adding hours of labor to even the simplest daily tasks. Weather turned harsher with height. Colder winds, longer winters, fewer sheltered spaces, and isolation made it slower for reinforcements or even fresh supplies to arrive in time when they were needed most. This is why most castles were never built on the most extreme, remote peaks. They were placed on just enough high ground, close enough to farmland, forests, and towns to remain sustainable through ordinary years, not only during a siege. Defense had to be balanced against survival, because a fortress that could repel any army but could not feed its own people season after season was not a victory. It was only a slower, quieter version of defeat. So why did medieval castles need a hill and a river to survive? Not because height alone made them strong, not because water alone kept them alive, but because together these two features built a system. One that watched before it was seen, delayed before it was attacked, supplied itself when it could, defended itself when it had to, and controlled the land far beyond its own walls, long after the last siege had ended. The builders were never simply constructing a castle. They were choosing a piece of geography and finishing the work with stone. So the next time you see a fortress standing on a hill above a river, ask yourself, was it really built to fight the land around it? Or was it built to become part of it, so completely that centuries later we can no longer imagine the landscape without it?